Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning meditation with St. Andrew's United Church. You would be here because you received the connection through our church newsletter or Facebook page or from the video site. We are thankful to Reverend John Crowdis for allowing us to use his video YouTube channel, Accessible Faith Project, for our Sunday services. I'm Reverend Bob Settle. I'm a retired minister as honorary associate here at St. Andrews, so I help out occasionally, and I'm glad to be sharing with you this morning. This morning I want to share with you something that I worked on quite a long time ago that we encountered, my wife and I, when we went to work in South America in 1970. And that is about the theology of liberation. Theology of liberation started in Latin America, and it almost seems a strange place because the church and the state were very tied together in Latin America. The church went there in the 1500s with the colonists, and they worked hand in hand with the king and the state to keep the people subservient to the state. And that was the way it was in Latin America for centuries. Then early in the last century, about the 1930s, the church started to open up a little bit. It started to organize lay groups through Brazil and other parts of Latin America, where many lay people became more active in the church and became more aware of what it does say in the Bible and what Jesus was saying and doing. And they began to think differently about the relationship of church and state and started to feel a need for some freedom from the state. This grew during the 60s. It was impulsed by Vatican II with Pope John Paul VI, or Paul VI, who really led an opening up of the Catholic Church around the world. And that was really widely opening in Latin America. So many people became much more aware and took the opening seriously. The bishops of Latin America met in 1968 in Medellin in Colombia, and they made a statement about Latin American society and the church in Latin American society, and really started to talk about a preferential option for the poor and the need for more care for the poor population in Latin America. Many groups in Latin America picked that up and shared that, one of them being the Lacombe group in Colombia. I want to talk about three main signs or three main tenets of the theology of liberation that all those who speak of theology of liberation seem to hold up as a very important part. The first one is a call to justice. The call to justice comes right out of the biblical text, for example, from Isaiah 3, verses 13 to 15. The Lord rises to argue his case. He stands to judge the peoples. The Lord enters into judgment with elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people? By grinding the face of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts. Well, in the late 60s and early 70s, many in the Latin American churches were holding up that call to justice. And they were looking at Latin American society and saying there's a problem here that has to do with the way things are. After the Medellin situation, and the Lacombe group in Colombia wrote this: behind the monumental buildings, the luxurious airports, the highways, there is a suffering, humiliated, and muzzled people rendered insensitive and submissive by the repressive forces of the violence installed in power. What must be done to liberate this baptized people, children of God, from their very real servitude and slavery? To use an expression of our bishops. So they were quoting the bishops from Medellin in that. They were picking up the themes that the bishops had spoken about, that being the Medellin meeting of the bishops in Colombia seems to me to be one of those spaces where you can see God touching and making things move. The very conservative bishop, mostly conservative bishops in Latin America came up with this very radical statement speaking of justice as an important part of the gospel. And like the Lacombe group, many others in Uruguay and all of Latin America picked up on those on that theme. The second theme is love. Love, we all know, is spoken of in the gospel of Jesus many times. It's spoken of by Paul, the great passage in 1 Corinthians 13, or in the letters of John, where John goes so far as to say God is love. Love is an important aspect of liberation theology. One of the early priests who was speaking in the vein of liberation theology was a priest in Colombia by the name of Camilo Torres. And he spoke in his writings of the importance of love, not only just the feeling of love for the people, but of that love becoming effective and making that love happen, making things happen so that people were doing better. So he spoke of if the acts of charity don't make a difference to the lack of housing and the hunger and the lack of health care and the lack of education in Colombian society, then it doesn't mean anything. I suppose like a clanging gong or cymbal, like Paul speaks of. Love needs to be effective. Nestor Paz Zamora, who was in Bolivia, spoke of love in much the same terms, in terms of caring for people, and it has to be effective. And you find that in the writings of others, like the Brazilian bishop, Elder Câmara, or the bishop of Buenaventura, where we lived, Don Valencia Cano. Summing up, talk about theology of liberation in 1971, a Colombian theologian, Gustavo Pérez Ramirez, said, "When I talk about the emergence of a theology of liberation, I will be referring to a growing awareness of the implication contained in the perennial commandment of love, with a new emphasis on effective love, and the need to create conditions in which love may be truly efficacious." So, love is the second major theme. The third major theme gives the name to the theology, the theme of liberation. Biblically, this comes from even our text in our service today, from Exodus, and the story of God leading the people out of slavery in Egypt to liberation. And so it's a freedom from slavery. But it's deeper than that. It's, and clearly through Jesus, people see liberation as being important as a liberation from sin. Now, sin shows itself in many ways, and in a society, it can be in exploitation and in the lording of some over others. Another Brazilian bishop, Antonio Fragoso, said this: "Christ came not only to free man from sin, Christ came to liberate him from the consequences of sin. These consequences are in our house, our street, our city, our interior, and are called prostitution, social discrimination, lack of housing and hygiene, lack of health services, money concentrated in few hands, etc., etc. So freedom from sin and freedom from some of the sins of greed, of, many of the Latin American theologians spoke of it as freedom from the sin that we find in capitalism and the inequalities that are shown in capitalism in general. And so many began supporting a different kind of option, an option of some kind of socialism. There was a gathering of several hundred theologians in Chile in 1973 under the banner of Christians of Socialism during the time of Salvador Allende, when Chile was looking at becoming a much more socialist kind of society and looking at the possibilities of that being the way that things could develop and people could overcome some of the oppression that is in the capitalist system. But there was always a bit of concern about that because they did not want to become yet another kind of oppression. Elder Câmara, bishop in Brazil, said this: "The experience of 2,000 years shows that the civitas humana, I guess that's civil society, ought not to be absorbed by the church. The church does not have the mission of creating its own civitas, or its own society, in which the gospel is converted into an economic, social, and political code. The civitas ought to be constructed by their own autonomous means. And so, as across the centuries, the church made the mistake of successfully constructing a feudal Christianity, a bourgeois Christianity, and a democratic Christianity, now it ought to be especially careful not to construct a socialist Christianity." In looking towards a different kind of picture for Christianity, though, and going towards, the image is going towards the reign of God, towards God's way of being, and to recognize that that's not in any of the ways that we humans have developed or are likely to develop. But we need to develop ways that seem closer to it, and as we do that, we need to remain critical of each of those ways to recognize that nothing that we create in terms of an order is a perfect kind of order. But liberation from sin, from the sins of a consumerist, greedy society to one that is more sharing seems to be part of the direction, but that's only part of the direction. It's not the whole direction. So that kind of is a quick picture of the basis for liberation theology. I think we in our time might take that seriously. What does it mean for us in a time of much consumerism, of a pandemic, of a huge difference right now between rich and poor? What are we in need of liberation from, and how can we make those moves towards some kind of liberation? Those are some thoughts for us to think about. Next week, I'm going to speak about some of the ways that the Christians in Latin America were beginning to try to work on making some change for their society. So we will talk again next week.